12 photographs, 12 birds that science declared gone forever. And at least one of these images might be lying to us. Not about being alive, but about being dead. For the next few minutes, we're going pixel by pixel through every one of them. We'll check the light, the anatomy, the shadows, the metadata, the history of the photographer holding the camera. Some of these proofs will fall apart before we even finish describing them. Others won't fall apart at all, because the scientists studying them still can't agree on what they're looking at. And by the time we reach number 1, you'll be looking at a 2022 drone video that a team of real ornithologists is still arguing about right now, in peer-reviewed journals, in the swamps of Louisiana. Stick around for that one. It might be the closest thing to hard evidence Extinction has ever produced. Let's start with the fake that isn't even trying to hide it. Number 12. The dodo. Picture this. A blurry photograph surfaces on social media in 2023, captioned, "Rare 19th century photo of a living dodo, recently declassified." It gets shared 200,000 times before anyone stops to check the math. The dodo stood about a meter tall, roughly the height of a golden retriever standing on its hind legs, with a hooked gray beak the size of a human hand and stubby wings it never used to fly. It lived only on the island of Mauritius, and it vanished around 1681, hunted by sailors and eaten alive, quite literally, by the pigs and rats they brought with them. Therefore, the math is simple, and it's brutal. Photography wasn't invented until 1826, a full 145 years after the last confirmed dodo died. So there is no such thing as an authentic dodo photograph. There never can be. Still, that hasn't stopped the image from spreading. Here's where it gets strange, though. Because when researchers ran the picture through reverse image search, they didn't find a hoax from a bored teenager. They found an AI image generator's watermark quietly cropped out of the corner. The counterpoint barely needs stating. This isn't a mystery, it's a magic trick, and once you know where the seams are, you can't unsee them. A generative model trained on dodo skeletons and old illustrations built something that looks plausible enough to fool a scroll, but not plausible enough to survive a single afternoon of scrutiny. So if the dodo is the easiest fake to catch, you'd think a flightless giant from the other side of the world would be next in line for debunking. You'd be right. Number 11. The giant moa. Deep in Fjordland, on New Zealand's South Island, a hunting guide radios in a sighting. Something tall moving through the bush, taller than a man, taller than the tree line of ferns around it. He gets one photograph before it disappears. The giant moa was an animal built on a scale that still sounds invented, up to 3.5 meters tall, roughly the height of a basketball hoop, and heavy enough that it had no need for wings at all. It simply didn't have any. It disappeared from New Zealand roughly by the 1440s, hunted into oblivion by Polynesian settlers within a couple of centuries of their arrival. So the extinction wasn't a slow fade, it was fast, and it was total. But stories of moa in the backcountry never really stopped. Fjordland's valleys are some of the most unexplored terrain on Earth, and that gap between unexplored and unexplained is exactly where legends like this thrive. Here's the twist. This particular photograph has circulated for decades attached to different names, different dates, different valleys. Always slightly rewritten, always just specific enough to sound credible again. And that's the giveaway. Wildlife researchers who've traced the image back note that the moa in the frame lines up almost exactly with the silhouette of a red deer standing in tall grass, antlers folded into shadow. It's not a cover-up. It's pattern recognition doing exactly what it evolved to do. Finding a shape we want to see. If a deer can become a moa with the right shadows, imagine what a museum drawer full of feathers can become. Number 10. The Great Auk. In an antique shop outside Reykjavik, a photograph surfaces. 2 upright black and white birds standing on volcanic rock, sold to a collector as the last great auks, photographed before extinction. The great auk was essentially the northern hemisphere's penguin, about 75 centimeters tall, roughly the size of a large goose, flightless, and built for diving instead of flying. Its story ends on a single rock. LD Island, off the coast of Iceland, June 3, 1844, when the last breeding pair was killed and their one egg was crushed underfoot by the very fishermen sent to collect specimens for a private collector. Photography existed by then, barely, The daguerreotype had been announced only 5 years earlier, in 1839, so technically, the window wasn't impossible. But no verified photograph of a living great auk has ever surfaced. Still, the timing is close enough that fakes keep finding an audience. Here's where the twist arrives. When this particular image was examined under magnification, the birds' beaks curve the wrong way, and their posture matches a completely different species down to the feather pattern. The forensic verdict: these are razorbills, close cousins of the great auk, and the photo itself dates to decades after 1844. Mislabeled, not malicious, most likely, but mislabeled all the same, and then repeated by enough people that the mistake calcified into evidence. Not every fake is a lie. Some of them are just a caption that outlived the truth. Number 9. The Labrador duck. A tourist at a small natural history museum snaps a photo through the glass of a display case, posts it online with the caption, "Living Labrador duck spotted. Museum hiding it in plain sight." The Labrador duck was a striking black and white sea duck, roughly the size of a mallard, with a distinctive scoop-shaped bill built for filtering shellfish out of coastal waters. It was already rare when European naturalists started documenting North America's coastline, and by 1878 it was gone completely. So thoroughly gone that scientists still aren't fully certain what pushed it over the edge, whether it was overhunting, habitat loss along the coast, or a food supply that collapsed before anyone thought to measure it. What makes this case unusual is that the bird in the photo is real. It's not a drawing, not a hologram, not an AI hallucination. Therefore, the debunking here isn't about the image being fake. It's about what the image actually shows. Here's the twist. The sighting is a taxidermy mount, one of fewer than 60 Labrador duck specimens preserved in museum collections worldwide, standing behind glass under gallery lighting that gives its glass eyes an unsettling, lifelike shine. The counterpoint is almost funny in hindsight. Museum lighting is designed to make dead things look alive, not the other way around, and the photograph's caption never once claimed the bird was inside a display case, which tells you the deception was less about the picture and more about what wasn't said. The line between a hoax and an honest mistake, it turns out, can be as thin as a sentence someone chose not to write. Number 8. The Carolina parakeet. A backyard photographer in Florida captures a burst of green, yellow, and orange feathers at a bird feeder in 2019 and asks a local birdwatching forum, "Is this what I think it is?" The Carolina parakeet was North America's only native parakeet, roughly the size of a mourning dove, with a lime green body and a head that blazed orange and yellow like a struck match. It disappeared from the wild by the early 1900s, and the last known individual, a bird named Incas, died in the very same Cincinnati zoo cage that had held the last passenger pigeon just 4 years earlier, 1918, closing a door that 1914 had already started shutting. So the photograph should be impossible. But Florida's swamps and suburbs are also home to escaped and feral parrots from the pet trade, sun conures, gende conures, and various South American parakeets that share almost the same palette of green, yellow, and orange. Here's the twist. Wildlife biologists who reviewed the image noted the wing shape and the tail length don't quite match any known escapee species either, which kept the case circulating in birding forums far longer than the obvious answer usually allows. The most likely verdict still is a hybrid escapee or a color mutation pet bird rather than a resurrected species, but most likely isn't certain. And that gap is exactly where 100 years of hope keeps finding room to live. A century of wishful thinking doesn't disappear just because the math says it should. Number 7. The passenger pigeon. Somewhere in rural Wisconsin, a hunter's trail camera captures a short, grainy clip of a flock moving low over a cornfield at dusk. And for a few days, it becomes the most argued about 11 seconds in amateur ornithology. The passenger pigeon wasn't just common, it was almost incomprehensibly abundant. Flocks that historians described as blotting out the sun for hours, numbering in the billions across North America. And then, in barely 4 decades of industrial-scale hunting and habitat clearing, that number went to 0. Martha, the last of her kind, died in the Cincinnati Zoo on September 1, 1914, a species that once darkened the sky, reduced to a single bird in a single cage. So a rediscovered flock would be one of the most significant wildlife events in a century. which is exactly why ornithologists took the footage seriously enough to actually analyze it, instead of dismissing it outright. Here's the twist. Frame-by-frame review showed wing beats and flock formation that line up far more closely with mourning doves or rock pigeons flying in poor light than with any confirmed passenger pigeon behavior on record. But, and this is the part skeptics don't love admitting, mourning doves are close enough relatives that some of the confusion is genuinely defensible, not just wishful. The counterpoint here isn't "you're wrong," it's "you're looking at the bird's closest living cousin, and cousins can look like ghosts if the light is bad enough." A species doesn't come back because we miss it, but it's remarkable how often its shadow shows up in exactly the shape we're hoping for. Number 6. The Huya. In New Zealand's Te Urewera forest, an amateur photographer chasing a rare bird call in the early 2000s gets one blurred frame of a black bird with a long, curved orange bill before it vanishes into the canopy. And Maori elders in the region say their own oral histories never fully accepted that the bird was gone at all. The Huya was unusual even by extinction standards. Males and females had completely different beak shapes, the males short and straight, the females long and curved like a scythe, each suited to a different way of prying grubs out of rotting wood, a division of labor that existed nowhere else in the bird world. It was last confirmed alive in 1907, though unconfirmed reports kept trickling in for decades after, mostly from the same remote forest ranges. Here's why this one carries more weight than most. It isn't just a photograph, it's a photograph layered on top of generations of Maori testimony that treated extinct as a scientific label, not a verdict on the forest's memory. Still, here's the twist within the twist. When ornithologists examined the blurred 2000s photo, the curve of the bill and the proportions of the tail feathers matched a tuai, a much more common New Zealand honey-eater, photographed at a bad angle with the light behind it. The counterpoint doesn't erase the oral history, though, and researchers are careful to say so. A debunked photograph and a living tradition of uncertainty are two completely different kinds of evidence, and only one of them can be settled by a camera. Some extinctions get buried in silence. This one got buried underneath 100 years of people insisting it wasn't over yet. Number 5. The slender-billed curlew. Merja zerga, a wetland on the Moroccan coast, 1995. A team of ornithologists on a routine survey lift their binoculars toward a small wading bird with a delicately thin, slightly down-curved bill, and photograph what would become the last widely accepted image of a living slender-billed curlew anywhere on Earth. The slender-billed curlew was never abundant even at its healthiest, a slim, pale shorebird about the size of a pigeon, distinguished mainly by a bill so fine it looked almost too delicate for probing mud, which, ornithologists now think, may have made it dependent on a narrow, fragile diet that couldn't survive the draining of Europe's wetlands through the 20th century. So the Morocco photograph should have been the beginning of a recovery story, a confirmed population to protect and rebuild. Instead, 3 decades of searching afterward turned up almost nothing solid. Here's the twist that keeps this case alive in real scientific literature, not just online forums. A reassessment of historical specimens and sightings published in the early 2020s, cross-checking decades of claimed records, concluded that many of the confirmed sightings after 1995 likely can't be distinguished from a closely related curlew species, but that the 1995 Morocco photographs themselves hold up. The counterpoint is uncomfortable for anyone hoping for good news. The best evidence we have doesn't prove the species survived. It proves the species was still here in 1995, and everything since then is silence dressed up as hope. If the last confirmed photograph of a bird is also one of the most contested, what does that say about every photograph that came after it? Number 4. The Eskimo curlew, Galveston Island, Texas, 1962. A photographer named Don Blights, working with a small hunting party, manages to photograph, and controversially, collect, what remains one of the last widely accepted physical encounters with a living Eskimo curlew. The Eskimo curlew was once so numerous that 19th century hunters described shooting them by the wagon load during migration, a mid-sized shorebird roughly the length of a dinner plate, built for a punishing round-trip migration between the Arctic tundra and the grasslands of South America. Unregulated market hunting and the conversion of prairie habitat crushed the population inside a few devastating decades, and by the mid-20th century, sightings had become vanishingly rare. So the Texas encounter mattered enormously. It wasn't a blurry photo from a stranger. It was a documented, physically examined bird, studied by people who knew exactly what they were looking at. Here's the twist. After 1962, sporadic photographic claims kept surfacing for decades. Texas, Argentina, Canada, some taken seriously enough to be discussed in ornithological circles, before being quietly walked back once closer analysis favored a very similar relative, the whimbrel, as the far more likely culprit. The counterpoint that birdwatchers still argue about today is exactly how much weight to put on that 1962 encounter. Is it the last confirmed sighting of a living population? Or the last confirmed sighting of the last individuals? A closing door rather than an open one? Every photograph after 1962 has tried to answer that question. None of them fully has. Number 3. Bachman's warbler, a birdwatcher in a South Carolina swamp, working through dense cane thickets with a long lens, captures several frames of a small yellow and olive songbird with a distinctive black throat patch and posts the images to a birding community that has been waiting, in some cases literally for decades, for exactly this kind of proof. Bachman's warbler was always a bird of specialized disappearing habitat, a small songbird, barely the length of a human thumb from beak to tail, that depended on cane thickets and bottomland swamp forest across the southeastern United States, a habitat that logging and agriculture steadily erased through the 20th century. The last widely accepted sighting came in 1988 in a Louisiana swamp, and after that, silence, decades of organized searches turning up nothing conclusive. So when new photographs started circulating from South Carolina swampland, active ornithologists didn't dismiss them the way they might dismiss a dodo hoax. They organized follow-up expeditions. Here's the twist. The photographs show real anatomical details consistent with the species, the throat pattern, the wing bars, the overall proportions, details that are hard to fake by accident and specific enough that several experienced birders initially called it a credible match. But the counterpoint is the same one that haunts almost every warbler wars case in North American birding. Without a captured specimen, a clear recording of its song, or a second confirmed observer at the exact same location, photographic evidence alone, however convincing, has never been enough to reverse an extinction declaration. So the file stays open, not because the evidence is weak, but because the bar for reversing extinct is set almost impossibly high. And maybe it should be. Number 2. The Cuban ivory-billed woodpecker. Eastern Cuba, the remote forests around Ochito de Agua, where in the late 1980s, and again through the 1990s, researchers including Dutch ornithologist Marchand Lamertink led expeditions specifically searching for a subspecies of ivory-billed woodpecker found nowhere else on Earth, and came back with tracks, feeding sign, and fragmentary audio, but never a clean, undisputed photograph. The Cuban ivory-bill was slightly smaller than its North American cousin, but built on the same unmistakable scale, nearly the length of a crow, with a wingspan approaching that of a red-tailed hawk, and a bone-white bill powerful enough to strip bark off a tree in sheets the size of a dinner plate. Deforestation across Cuba through the 20th century collapsed the old-growth pine and hardwood forest the bird depended on, and by the 1990s, most ornithologists considered it functionally extinct, even without a formal declaration. Therefore, every expedition since has carried enormous weight, because unlike some cases on this list, nobody's claiming a miracle here. They're claiming a species that was documented alive within living memory, in habitat that still technically exists, just badly fragmented. Here's the twist. More recent search efforts, including camera trap and acoustic monitoring projects through the 2010s and into the 2020s, have recorded knocking and call patterns consistent with the species' known behavior. Sounds, not images, but sounds specific enough to reopen serious scientific interest. The counterpoint is one every field ornithologist repeats like a mantra. Similar-sounding double knocks can be produced by other woodpecker species entirely, and acoustic evidence, without a photograph or a specimen, has burned researchers before. So Cuba's woodpecker sits exactly where the whole video has been building toward, not debunked, not confirmed, just genuinely, maddeningly unresolved. Number 1. The ivory-billed woodpecker. Arkansas, February 2004. A kayaker named Gene Sparling, paddling through the Cache River bottomlands, reports seeing an enormous black and white woodpecker unlike anything he'd encountered before. Within weeks, two more experienced birders, Tim Gallagher and Bobby Harrison, follow up on his report and independently report their own sighting, and a species considered functionally extinct since the 1940s suddenly becomes the biggest story in American ornithology. The ivory-billed woodpecker earned its nickname, the Lord God bird. Honestly, nearly 50 centimeters long, roughly the size of a red-tailed hawk with a crow's build, and a bill the color of bone, strong enough to strip entire slabs of bark off dead trees the way a crowbar peels paint. Its decline tracked almost perfectly with the logging of America's old-growth bottomland forests, so completely that by the time conservationists tried to protect what was left, there was barely any habitat left to protect. The 2004 sightings led to a now famous piece of blurry video footage, shot by David Luneau, 4 seconds long, showing a large black and white bird flushing from a tree. Footage that the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, one of the most respected bird research institutions in the world, analyzed frame by frame and stood behind as consistent with an ivory-billed woodpecker. Skeptics countered that the wing beats and flight pattern matched a pileated woodpecker just as well, and the debate never fully resolved. Here's where it gets strange again, though, because the story didn't end there. In 2022, a research team led by ornithologist Stephen Latta of the National Aviary published a peer-reviewed paper in the journal Ecology and Evolution, presenting years of trail camera photographs and drone footage recorded in the swamps of Louisiana. Footage they analyzed frame by frame for wing beat frequency, wing pattern, and flight behavior, arguing it was consistent with a small surviving population of ivory-billed woodpeckers. The counterpoint arrived almost immediately, and it came from serious people. Other ornithologists reviewing the same footage argued the images were still too distant, too brief, and too consistent with pileated woodpeckers to meet the evidentiary bar science requires for declaring a species alive. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which had proposed officially declaring the ivory-billed woodpecker extinct in 2021, delayed that decision specifically because of the unresolved dispute, an active federal agency in effect refusing to close the file. So here's where the whole investigation ends, not with a confirmed photograph and not with a debunked one, but with a government agency and a peer-reviewed journal disagreeing, in real time, about whether a bird that hasn't been undeniably photographed in 80 years is extinct at all. 12 photographs. We started with a fake so obvious it invented its own watermark, and we ended with a dispute that federal scientists still haven't settled. Somewhere between those two extremes, the line between gone and hiding stopped being a hard fact and started looking a lot more like a spectrum. That was the thesis from the very beginning. That extinction, as a photograph, is a much shakier kind of proof than we like to admit, built on light, timing, distance, and the very human habit of seeing what we're hoping to find. 12 species. 12 verdicts. And only the confident ones, the dodo and the moa and the mislabeled great auk, actually resolved into something clean and closed. So maybe the real question isn't whether any of these birds survived. Maybe it's this. How many more extinct species are sitting exactly where the ivory bill sits right now? Not proven gone, not proven here, just unphotographed clearly enough for certainty either way. The next time a rare photo of an extinct animal crosses your feed, you already know the checklist now. The light, the anatomy, the history behind the camera. Look closer before you believe it. And if you want to keep building that instinct with us, the next investigation is one video away.